greetings to you all. Welcome to the world of vampires, werewolves, witches, shapeshifters and hybrids with all sorts of monsters in between. Since I am currently writing the first 4 chapters or episodes of the Vampire Cop Season 2, I thought this video would be a really good idea for new and returning viewers to not only explain the series as a whole but to give a recap of every episode thus far. Furthermore, just to clarify the burning suspicion, my stories are not narrated by AI. This is me, this is my voice, and I can change it depending on the character. I can make my voice really deep when I'm talking for Ragnar the White Wolf.
Oh, I can be really high-pitched when speaking for Baba Yaga.
But yeah, all my stories are written and narrated by me. So without further ado, let's get into it. Oh, and thank you for 2,000 subs. Prologue. There's a vampire in the woods. Fillian Hunt, aka the Vampire Cop, first made his appearance in the Curse of the Werewolf series. I specifically wrote this chapter to make it seem like he was the villain. This story begins with 2 kids on the ground escaping from something in the woods. We see a pale, eerie man wearing a long black coat with slicked back hair, red eyes and sharp fangs examining the scene. Then he picks up the kids and takes them to his home on the outskirts of the woods in Redwater. Now, Redwater is a land mainly consisting of witches, herbalists, alchemists and shapeshifters. Rarely would you see the likes of vampires or werewolves being seen in this land. Long story short, vampires live in Cascara, werewolves live in Houndsville, and the land of Freya belongs to the elves. However, living in a cave below the woods of Redwater was Victor Humbridge, the special class grey werewolf. Special class meaning these werewolves were not hunched like monsters, rather retained their human memories while being able to talk. Victor sees the strange man in the distance carrying the kids over his shoulder, then begins to hunt the man down. When the werewolf approaches the log cabin house in the woods, he sees the kids, a boy and girl, staring out the window, and they don't seem to be in any danger at all. If anything, they have an expression of relief on their face. However, before the werewolf could even process anything, he gets elbowed to the back of his head, a hit that was so fast and precise, it drops him down to one knee. Now, I wanted this fight scene to be really dark and gritty, especially with the thick fog engulfing the woods at night. It's at this moment we see some of the skills the vampire actually has. He's extremely fast, merely a blur to the naked eye. He has fingernails that can extend 6 inches long and are curved rather than perfectly straight. The fight continues with the vampire landing those sneaky hits on the werewolf, showing that the vampire's speed can't really be matched. The only way Victor levels the playing field is by anticipating the vampire's movements, striking where he thinks the vampire will be. The fight then takes a more grueling close combat approach that shows these 2 supernatural beings quite evenly matched in terms of fighting ability, though they do have different skills. The werewolf is more of a wild brawler, brute force, strong claw swipe, circular winging punches, whereas the vampire is skillful and tactful, showing the years of training behind him. The fight eventually comes to a halt when the 2 kids run and stand in front of the vampire protecting him. Confused, the werewolf sheathes his claws and notices there are strange folk standing behind them. A man and woman with peculiar appearances, like pieces of skin had been stitched onto their faces. An argument breaks out between vampire and werewolf in which the vampire blames Victor for protecting those strange people behind him. The kids tell the werewolf what happened, how they've been taken by those people and had barely escaped from them, then passed out in the woods through sheer exhaustion. The vampire then mentions those people are actually cannibals, a clan that abducts people, skins their faces and wears it to blend in. We then also find out the vampire has been hunting this clan for quite a while. Remember, at this point we don't even know the vampire's name, let alone him being a cop. Werewolf and vampire then get rid of the horde of cannibals in brutal fashion, protecting the kids in the woods. Just before sunrise, we come to know the vampire is an inspector in the Redwater Police Force, or RPF, and goes by the name Fillian. Once hearing the werewolf story, he gives Victor advice on whom to seek help from for the bloodlust. This is the part in the chapter of which Myra, the Witch of Redwater, is first mentioned, though vaguely. The chapter ends with Fillian bidding farewell to the werewolf and the kids as they make their way to the town of the witch, while Fillian enters his home just before sunshine could hit his door. In all fairness, the vampire cop was just a side character. When I wrote him, I thought he would be a good addition to the werewolf world, like helping Victor. However, when more of my subscribers began asking about him, then it gave me the opportunity to write his own series, a genre that I'm most comfortable writing: mystery horror. Episode 1: Hunt for Werewolves. So I remember trying to find a surname for Fillian, and no matter how many names I came up with, it just didn't fit the character. And I titled the episode Hunt for Werewolves because I knew what the title would be before even writing it. And I said, hey, why not call him Fillian Hunt? So, fun fact, the title is actually a double meaning. Anyway, this was the first official episode of the Vampire Cop series, and if you've noticed, this was also the first time that I wrote a story in 3 parts, like an actual script: Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Also, keep in mind I had 500 subscribers when this episode came out, and I have never written any vampire-related content prior. This episode begins with a little bit of backstory of Fillian, not too much though, as I wanted my audience to still have questions about him. However, we do find out that he's 102 years old and he was a locksmith before he was turned into a vampire in the Redwater Massacre. Once again, I mention nothing further of the Redwater Massacre just yet, only that a man going by the name Gilroy, which is later revealed to be Dracula, has turned Fillian into a vampire. I do show an image of what the vampire cop looked like before. Long hair, mustache with a light beard, and his expression and body language is that of a kind, happy man. Fast forward in his years as a vampire, I hint at the fact that he was an absolute bloodthirsty monster. Therefore, he reached out to the Witch of Redwater, Myra, to help him. There's also a hint of their relationship, like they've had something before, an old flame that is no longer ignited. The story then cuts to the current timeline when it shows Fillian wearing his pajamas sipping blood from a cup, which is an immensely important detail. We also see that he has a cupboard of blood bags, just the way that a human would stack or keep their tea bags or coffee. Now those aren't just random details, I wrote that scene specifically that way. That subtle detail shows the audience that this man may be a vampire, but he's trying his absolute best to live like an ordinary human. But as the audience, you may wonder, where did the blood bags even come from? Hence I introduce a new character, Mrs. Armonai, the Redwater veterinarian who supplies Fillian with blood from wounded animals that cannot be saved. Once more showing the audience that he has gone through great lengths not to feed on humans. Fillian then receives a phone call, and this is where the story begins changing. Fillian's house phone is that old type of phone, the one with the winding numbers. Captain Langley is on the other end of the line, the captain of the Redwater police station who shares a troublesome issue. Inspectors Holt and Lycan have been working a missing persons case in Lullaby Town, the town of werewolves, and have not been seen since. Shocker to the audience. The captain not only knows about werewolves but also the fact that Fillian is a vampire, suggesting that he once told the captain his secret. The vampire cop says he'll take care of it and will find Inspector Holt and Lycan, 2 experienced officers that he respected greatly. They were kind and helpful to him when he joined the force. Act 1 ends with Fillian heading towards his basement, which shows a library of old law books about all sorts of creatures, as well as an arsenal of weapons. Then he equips himself with his pistol, silver bullets, and a long heavy silver chain, since silver can slow down werewolves or kill them entirely. Fillian then takes the night train to Houndsville, again showing the audience that despite his speed, he doesn't want anyone else knowing that he's a vampire, like he's ashamed of being one. He constantly makes excuses for the way he looks. Skin allergy, powder on his face, late night drinking for the weird eye color, random excuses that he comes up with on the spot. Furthermore, by him taking the night train also substantiates him trying to live a normal human life. He then reaches Lullaby Town after examining tracks in the woods, werewolf tracks. However, still no sign of Holt or Lycan. More importantly, there's a thought that constantly plays back in his mind. Houndsville was out of the RPF's jurisdiction. Why on earth would Captain Langley send him here? Act 2 begins with the investigation procedure. Fillian then questions the townfolk, and I love writing scenes like these, where dialogue tells a story rather than narration. We see a kinder, gentle side of Fillian in the way he speaks to the children in the town, comforting them in a time of worry and fear. The townfolk mentions how werewolves came at night and dragged people out of their homes. This was a random attack, no rhyme or reason to it. However, when they described the werewolves to Fillian, he became suspicious. Houndsville had naturally born werewolves, which means men who were born with a lycanthropy affliction. These men only become werewolves during a full moon and look like actual wolves, just much larger and more frightening. However, the townsfolk descriptions were rather different. These werewolves were hunched like monsters, so not like Victor, though their eyes were yellow and saliva dripped from their mouths like rabid animals. This detail alone gives away the fact that these werewolves were the cursed ones, men who undergo or practice dark rituals under the influence of a witch. More so, the children mention seeing a strange woman strolling in the town before the attack commenced. At first, she was young and beautiful when she thought no one was looking. Then she showed her true self, an old crone with skin like rotting flesh and untidy white hair. Act 2 ends with Fillian re-entering the woods, but now he finds the bodies of Holt and Lycan. One of them is on the ground torn to shreds while the other is up in the tree, what's left of her at least. Then he can hear footsteps behind him, heavy, monstrous, thunderous footsteps. The cursed werewolves have him surrounded. Act 3 has to be the most brutal, action-packed storytelling that I've done at the time. This chapter really showcases the vampire cop's skills. He uses the silver chain against the werewolves, burning their skin and fur and taking them out with ease. Hordes of werewolves keep coming, and he sees that even natural-born werewolves, just a few of them at least, were part of the onslaught. When the alpha comes in, more humanoid and powerful, the audience expects another one-on-one fearsome battle, but I thought that was rather cliché. More so, with Fillian being an inspector, he needs to be sharp and think on his feet. Hence, when the alpha approaches, rather than wasting energy engaging in a fist fight with this monster, not that he was incapable of doing so, he just wanted answers and wanted them quickly. Therefore, he uses his pistol and fires a silver bullet in the werewolf's leg. His assumption was correct. These were the cursed werewolves working for the witch that entered the town before the attack. The vampire cop beats the information out of this werewolf now turned man, literally. He also finds out the werewolves were tasked to actually capture him, not Lycan and Holt, as the crow needed a vampire's heart for a ritual. Angry and heartbroken about how many innocents suffered at the hands of these werewolves, Fillian doesn't arrest them. Instead, he uses the silver chain to drape their bodies across the trees like Christmas lights. This detail tells us that Fillian can be and still is a monster beneath the flesh and shouldn't be trifled with. When he exits the woods, the townfolk kind of know that he is a vampire, and he doesn't feel the need to lie to them. He brings along terrible news that he found the bodies of their loved one in the woods. With the help of the village folk, he burns down the woods. We also see a little girl from Lullaby Town gifting Fillian her pink teddy bear for saving their home against another werewolf attack. Fillian, in his 100 years of being alive, or shall I say undead, rarely or never received gifts, so this one was rather special to him. Later on, as the series unfolds, you see the same pink teddy bear on one of the shelves in his library. When he returns home with a heavy heart, he reads up about vampire rituals and why the witch needed his heart. He stumbles upon a page citing a beast awakening ritual, but then at that moment he gets another call. Now we see a new character introduced into the story, one that will be very important as the series goes along. Lara Mills, the new acting captain of the Redwater Police Force. She calls to tell him they were trying to get a hold of him, but it seemed he wasn't at home. She tells him that Captain Langley has been found dead. since last night. Fillian drops the phone, absolutely horrified. He's baffled as to who or what spoke to him, masquerading as Captain Langley, sending him on this dangerous mission just a few hours ago. He doesn't know in this moment, but you, the audience, do. You see the crone was actually the one pretending to be his captain, stealing Langley's memories before killing him, then making the call to Fillian Hunt as a way to lure him into Lullaby Town. Episode 2, The Crimson Lycan. For this chapter, the story kicks off as a direct continuation. Fillian is taken aback by the news of his former captain's death, then dons his coat to leave the house to find answers. However, there's someone already outside his door. Enter Captain Lara Mills, who has a sense of urgency in her tone as well as her body language. Fillian tries his best to get her to politely leave, but it's not just Captain Langley's death that baffles her. It's something more. When sunrise approaches, she sits in Fillian's living room while he stands in the shadows, trying to act normal. He's awkward and tense, and the vampire cop is absolutely hopeless at lying. Nobody in the police force besides Captain Langley has met him outside the night shift. We then find out that Captain Mills is working on Captain Langley's investigation. Yet another secret that he has to keep from her for not telling her about the strange phone call that he received last night. But then her attention shifts towards Fillian. Captain Mills begins sharing a short story of a crimson werewolf-like creature that hunted her in the woods back when she was a young girl. She remembers running for her life, but she was also saved by someone. This peculiar man who wore a black jacket and black pants, short untidy hair with glowing red eyes and skin paler than a gloomy day. She then speaks about how the strange man moved like the wind and saved her from such a monster, making the werewolf-like creature retreat. However, that incident took place 30 years ago. Fillian begins feeling nervous. He can feel his body tensing because he knows where this is going. That mysterious pale man moving like the wind was him. Strange how Captain Lara Mills has aged, but he hasn't. She then begins to provide evidence as to why she knows for sure that he was the vampire who saved her, but Fillian very poorly denies it. Mills talks about how she observed him during the night shift. Fillian, hanging by a thread, still says she's mistaken, though there was an easy way to test out this theory. She asked Fillian to step away from the shadows and walk into the sunlight, thus revealing his secret with his hesitance, as they both know that he would combust into flames if he did so. This also shows that Mills has been studying him for a long time. Vampires, werewolves, their strengths, their weaknesses is not common knowledge to ordinary folk, showing that she's been researching this. Mills also reveals the Crimson Lycan has returned, which doesn't make sense to Fillian. She doesn't know the vampire actually hunted down the Crimson Lycan and slaughtered it ages ago after the incident. Fillian Hunt was responsible for ending the bloodline of Lycans in Redwater due to the evil underground practices of turning ordinary people into lycanthropes. There's also a small chapter in this episode showing the lore that I've created for Lycans, like who they were, what they've done, and how they became Lycans. Though for this breakdown, I don't think it's really necessary going into detail with that. So, long story short, they were an evil group of monsters, more so because they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't mindless beasts that were afflicted with a curse. They were ordinary humans that developed the curse to become mindless beasts. Nevertheless, Fillian heads towards the town the Crimson Lycan was reported seen in. He walks through the town looking at the tall buildings while carrying out his investigation. Folk then talk about the cave below the town and rumors flood of a possessed woman strolling in that area. When Fillian goes down to the cave to inspect, he's joined by Captain Mills, of whom he chases away respectively despite her knowing his secret. This wasn't a "I only work cases alone" type of thing, he just didn't want her to get hurt. However, later on in the series you will see that Captain Mills is definitely not fragile. She's one hell of a captain. This underground cave that folks spoke of was actually the lair of the Lycans decades ago, still in ruins from when Fillian destroyed it, further confirming the vampire's suspicion. Whoever or whatever this crimson monster was definitely not a Lycan. And what we get next is probably the thing that has been commented on the most under that video. which is the rooftop chase scene. Fillian Hunt this entire time has been stalked by this crimson werewolf-like creature on the rooftop. Then the vampire cop and the supposed crimson Lycan play a game of cat and mouse on the rooftops of the tall buildings, ultimately leading them inside an alleyway. An epic fight takes place and Fillian defeats the monster the same way that he did back then. However, he cannot help but notice how weak the Lycan is, confirming his theory. This monster isn't the same beast that he fought back then. Once the creature is beat up to a pulp, it finally reveals itself not to be a Lycan or a monster, rather an actual demon. The events that follow next lead up to the werewolf series, so I won't be getting into that. However, there is a scene that I wrote to show how Fillian is able to think on his feet. Throughout the encounter with the demon inside the building, Fillian notices how it refuses to enter. The demon constantly looks at the puddles of water as well as the water dripping from an old pipe in the building. Fillian shoots the pipe and the water sprays onto the demon, burning him, thus allowing the vampire cop to escape. This scene is just to indicate that demons don't like water, it slows them down. It also shows you those books in Fillian's library aren't just for show. This man actually reads and remembers all sorts of lore for different type of creatures just so he knows how to defeat them. The recap or analysis for this episode is much shorter than the rest. For the remainder of this episode, it ties into the werewolf saga. For those who wish to see the vampire cop fight Ragnar the White Wolf or the Hellhound, you may do so in the Curse of the Werewolf series. I'm trying not to mix up the two for this analysis, solely keeping it to the Vampire Cop series. From this point onwards, I've kept Fillian in his own world. As a writer, I didn't feel confident that Fillian could hold his own, like I've always needed the special class werewolves to kind of make him shine. Then came the next episode and things got rather interesting, and I was proved wrong. Episode 3, Dracula and the Hybrids. I feel like this episode was a turning point for the series. Not only did it reach a broader audience, but I did get quite a bit subscribers from it. We've seen Fillian Hunt prior to this episode quite a few times, but now I needed to shed light on the burning question inside the audience mind. What really happened in the Redwater Massacre all those years ago? And how did Fillian become a vampire? This chapter begins a century ago. We see Fillian Hunt with his long dark hair, light beard like a stubble but a prominent mustache, working as a locksmith in his workshop. I still remember the line in the story that depicts him very well. He looks like a glamour boy, but his hands show the opposite. Veiny, rugged, scarred and dirty, showing how hard he's been working. We also see the village he lives in and how poor it actually is. His workshop itself is basically his home, of which he sleeps on the floor. Then he helps a customer, an old man named Mr. Fenwick. The Fenwicks were an old couple that helped Fillian Hunt find a place in the village. It's not stated clearly, but it is implied, especially through Fillian's interaction in this episode as well as the other ones to follow, that he's an orphan. Mr. Fenwick asks him to develop a locking mechanism for their door after being scammed by a few locals. Once the job is done, the old man begins counting coin, but Fillian gives him his warm smile and tells him this one is free. Mr. Fenwick should rather save the coin for their daughter's dowry, Anne-Marie's wedding. This is the first time we get a mention of Anne-Marie, but I don't show her just yet. Later that night, when Fillian is asleep, he gets up with a shock. There's a high-pitched, screeching, hissing sound above the village, with folk running and screaming in fear. He opens the door and sees half of his village burning down, and most of the villagers are slaughtered on the ground. The rest are running in fear, looking behind them each time, glancing at the sky. There's also mention of the infamous vampiric creature doing its rounds, which tells us that these folk have been living in fear, dreading the day their village would be the one that's targeted. Above them, there's a vampire monster with large bat-like wings, draining the blood from the villagers with every swoop it took. Fillian, a man that cannot fight at this moment, trembles with fear. He has every reason to flee the village in this moment, but he doesn't. This scene alone shows you that vampiric abilities was not what made Fillian who he is. He runs in the village trying to save as many as he can. escorting people to safety, carrying and helping them flee, whatever it takes. However, when he returns to the village, he sees Dracula holding Anne-Marie hostage. The vampire lord has his fingernails at the throat of the young woman, and Fillian sees the blood dripping from her neck. I also wanted Dracula to look really scary when he changes from creature to vampire. Vampires, in folklore at least, don't really transform if not into a bat-like creature. However, without even being in that form, Dracula's face still looks crumpled, with blood-red eyes and monstrous fangs. This shows the different levels of vampirism in this world, indicating he isn't like other vampires. He is known as a higher vampire. Now, I won't get into his history, but there is a video on my channel which tells the backstory of Vlad Tepes and how and why he became Dracula. Most of the comments under that video and later on all mention the same thing. Why did Vlad Tepes have to be evil? Why not make him a hero? And people said that only after hearing his story. But that's the whole point. That's what makes his story so tragic. Vlad Tepes was a hero, a loyal servant pushed beyond the breaking point. Humans were the ones that took everything from him, so now he takes everything from them. Now, coming back to the story, Dracula gives Fillian an ultimatum. He can try and save as many as he can in the village, which will ultimately be futile. Or he could test his strength against Dracula, the vampire lord, and rid the world of this monster once and for all. Fillian lunges to save Anne-Marie, but Dracula sinks his fangs into her neck as her life drains from her body. He then tosses her onto the ground like she was an object, not even a human. Last thing Fillian remembers of this incident was him running towards Dracula, and then it's blank after that, which means that he was killed. Fillian then recalls waking up as a vampire in the same village, seeing most of the people he knew massacred, including the Fenricks. He buries whoever and however many he can, with the last person being Anne-Marie in the woods. Then the episode shifts to the current timeline. Fillian rushes to the Redwater police station when he sees it engulfed in red smoke. Similar style to the wisp of black smoke that Fillian moves in. That tiny detail is very important later on. Vampires generally do not have the ability to move as smoke. They are fast, sure, but not so fast to travel in a cloud-like smoke. There are only 4 vampires that could and can do this, which you'll come to know about later on. Now, to Fillian's fearful surprise, he hears gunfire inside the precinct and a woman's laughter bouncing off the walls, but standing in front of him was none other than Dracula, a man that he recognizes all too well, a man he has waited patiently to kill. We then see a new and improved Dracula, this pale, tall man with broad shoulders and red eyes, his hair long and grey matching the color of his suit. He has this expression on his face, this arrogant, cunning, deceitful look. Just before the vampire cop charges forward to rip out his heart, Dracula holds up his finger, and that's the only time we see how long and sharp his fingernails are. He gives Fillian the same ultimatum. Fight him and maybe succeed now that Fillian is a vampire, or save his beloved inspectors in the police station. You have to understand how Fillian feels in this moment. He's been searching so long for Dracula just to kill him, and now that he finally has the chance, he cannot do it. He chooses the latter of the ultimatum while Dracula remains laughing outside, thus beginning the evil mind games played on the vampire cop. Dracula then travels into the night sky in a wisp of red smoke. Another important detail I'll explain later on as to why Fillian moves in black smoke and Dracula in red. When Fillian rushes inside the police station, he sees the inspectors fearing for their lives. They have their pistols pointed in front at a woman in black, moving just as quickly as Fillian does. She sways side to side with confidence and aura, though her laugh is rather maniacal. She's evil, her smile wide, her teeth long and sharp, and her eyes glowing red. However, when Fillian saw who this pale woman really was, he stood frozen. She looks at him, and the screams and the gunfire comes to a halt. It's been a while, she tells him, then bolts out the window, flying away into the night. However, the woman in black, the vampiress, does not move like Fillian or Dracula, rather has large bat-like wings that pop out from her spine. Once again, this detail is just to show you the different classes of vampires in this world. Oh, and that vampire woman Fillian saw was Anne-Marie. The story then goes on to show the suspicion the Redwater police force has against Fillian. They begin pointing their weapons at him, yelling and wanting to know why the woman never attacked him and how she knew him. Captain Mills comes to his aid and defends him. She mentions how the woman in black is infamous for these type of tactics. She's a serial killer after all. Fillian then enters Captain Mills' office as they go through the cold case of the woman in black. Mills shows Fillian witness reports of how folk reported seeing the woman in black strolling the Redwater woods at night. This has been going on for decades, but they never could catch her. It was no coincidence that whenever she was seen, people would go missing shortly after. One witness who survived her clutches gave the entire story. He was kidnapped from the woods and placed in a dungeon, but he never saw or knew where he was. The dungeon was filled with operating tables and diagrams and charts of the human brain. He also said that those being experimented on in the dungeon were not all human. Their blood were drained into vials and kept in cupboards like chemicals in a chemistry lab. However, he did see a portion of them were vampires, some were werewolves, but most were human. The woman in black had been doing this for as long as the Redwater police force could remember, but whenever they got close to her, she always disappeared. Fillian then tells Captain Mills how he knows the woman in black and her name is Anne-Marie. Though none of this makes sense to him. He buried her and her family after the Redwater massacre. Once again, this introduces a different level of vampirism. Somehow, Anne-Marie is working for Dracula and vampire necromancy is involved. However, the reports mentioning the recent sightings of the woman in black were in the woods near the outskirts of Redwater, exactly where Fillian had buried her all those years ago. Fillian then goes home to study the reports over the past 70 years of the woman in black. Mostly missing persons cases, but the sketches of said missing people made his skin crawl. Some of the missing victims were the same village people he knew back then, the same ones that he got to safety in the Redwater massacre. The next scene shows the vampire cop leaving his home during the day for the very first time in the series. He wears an old baggy hooded cloak that covers every portion of his skin from the sun. The cloak itself looks like something a beggar might use, not to draw so much of attention, showing that Fillian has done this before. He makes his way to the woods of Redwater at the spot that he buried Anne-Marie. He notices the grave has been dug out and not recently. Anne-Marie has been out for a very long time. Now, I really enjoyed writing the next part because it tells the story of the trees in Redwater, like giving them their own personality. If one quietens their mind and listens closely, the trees would echo the sounds and memories of what took place in the woods. Fillian then sits down and plays back everything in his mind. He remembered the reports mentioning how Anne-Marie disappeared whenever she was in the woods. However, he saw firsthand that she cannot travel in a wisp of smoke, not like him and Dracula. More so, if she flew away, folk would have seen her. Therefore, she must have an escape route. He runs at the speed of light, inspecting every location in the woods till he sees a pile of leaves that look different from the rest, almost like the bottom heap hasn't received sunlight. He moves the leaves and sees a hidden trapdoor. Fillian follows the flight of stairs leading to a dungeon, and then the fight scene takes place. This monstrous creature attacks him, but it's rather strange looking. Ears and fangs like a vampire, but fur like a werewolf. This is the first time in the series we see the hybrids, and the background music as well as the artwork screams tension. The vampire-werewolf hybrid is extremely fast. Fillian fires a few shots at it, but it dodges them. The vampire cop tries killing the beast using werewolf and vampire weaknesses, which doesn't seem to work. Fillian then remembers the witness report. Humans had their brains removed in the dungeon. What if these hybrids were being created with having their brains work as an on or off switch? Fillian attacks the hybrid with his long fingernails. 3 jabs, one to the chest, one underneath the armpit, and finally the last one at the top of its head through the skull. The hybrid's glowing yellow eyes turn off like a fused light bulb as it falls to the ground. More of these creatures emerge from the rooms in the dungeon, and Fillian deals with them swiftly. However, when they return to their human selves, Fillian sees that he just killed the people that he once knew in his village, the ones who went missing all those years ago. With guilt eating him up inside, trying to convince himself they weren't the people he knew, rather monsters, he sees the charts and the operating tables in the dungeon. Anne-Marie and Dracula have been mixing the blood of vampires, werewolves and humans to create hybrids. More troubling, this wasn't the only dungeon Anne-Marie has. This story ends with Fillian calling Captain Mills, telling her to keep the Redwater police force far away from this case. If the hybrids almost killed Fillian, can you imagine what they would do to the normal inspectors? Episode 4, The Shapeshifter of Redwater. Safe to say that Fillian Hunt has a lot on his plate right now. There's a crone gunning for his heart literally. There's Dracula, the vampire lord that everyone fears, somehow controlling the mind of Anne-Marie, a person Fillian once knew and has died more than 70 years ago. Captain Langley's murder investigation is still ongoing, and that's a lot for 3 episodes. However, things have been awfully quiet for the vampire cop in the past few nights. No sign of Anne-Marie, the crone, or Dracula. Fillian spends most of his time jotting down key points in his library of everything he has observed of the hybrids. For example, the journal entry is written in the point of view of Fillian. He recorded the hybrids' movements, what their weaknesses were, how they reacted to certain things he did during their fight. Just important points to take note of in case others may need it. Once again, this shows you Fillian's character. He's going through so much right now, but he's still thinking about others. Nevertheless, he still has work, and so he begins the night shift, hoping to solve cases while getting closer to answers for other matters in his life. You have to remember that Fillian cannot share these things with the Redwater police force. Everyone will know he's a vampire. Though when he enters the police station to begin his shift, the old telephones begin ringing one after the other. Fillian rushes to the aid of his fellow inspectors, helping them write down witness reports that keep flooding in. 2 new characters are introduced, Felicia and Julian, inspectors that sit alongside Fillian in the police station. Julian is a 45-year-old large bald man who showed Fillian the ropes when he joined the force. I also mentioned he worked in the RPF for 27 years and has turned down the captain position 6 times. This detail seems rather random at the time but crucially important later on. Felicia joined the force 1 year after Fillian. The sketch artists in the police station then bring life to the 15 reports made in the past 5 minutes. However, Fillian picks up the first 5 reports that came in. 5 creatures were spotted at 5 different locations, quite close to each other. After further reading on, he slams the report file shut, then bolts out the station. From this point onwards in the video, if I sound slightly different, it's because I'm coming down with something. Captain Mills chases after him confused, wondering where he was going. Fillian says all the reports have been misunderstood. 5 creatures, a werewolf, a vampire, a woodland beast, an unknown animal, and a creature with yellow eyes and horns on its head. There were never 5 monsters to begin with. It was only one person responsible for this. How so? Captain Mills asks, and Fillian ends the chapter by saying, it's a shapeshifter. Chapter 2 begins with me showing the audience the layout of Redwater. This makes it easier to understand the 5 locations of the alleged monster sightings. This also brings the audience to work alongside Fillian in real time and truly understand how the vampire cop is making his deductions. It's logic and reasoning, not just protagonist plot armor. We then go through each of the 5 creatures at these locations, and it's quite obvious the reports contradict each other, though it isn't the fault of the witnesses. If one didn't know about these monsters that exist in Redwater, those witness reports would be gospel. There's a portion of the episode of me creating the lore behind shapeshifters and how these supernatural beings differ from the other monsters like werewolves and vampires. Shapeshifters were the struggling class of folk. They were born with the ability to alter their appearances. Most of the time they used to transform into animals just to avoid being caught in the witch hunts. Nevertheless, they really are good folk. struggling to make a living in Redwater and taking on any job they can get. Unlike men who turn into werewolves that have no telltale signs of who they really are, shapeshifters are easily recognizable from the blue birthmarks on their neck. Shapeshifters also hold their relationship with human folk in high regard. You treat one of them with kindness and the entire group in Redwater will treat you like royalty. However, as with any group of people, there will always be those who deviate from good and follow the path of evil. Fillian tracks down the shapeshifter at the last location in the report. We then find out the shapeshifter is actually hiding inside the farmhouse, while the woman opening the door speaking to the vampire cop is absolutely terrified. Shortly after, there's a fight scene that takes place and the shapeshifter is rather good. Really gives Fillian a run for his money. Have you noticed how these fights taking place besides for episode 1 are never one-sided? Werewolves, vampires, witches, shapeshifters, Fillian is always pushed to his limits. This just goes to show that he isn't invincible. Fillian then defeats the shapeshifter by using its own strength against it. With each punch landed by Fillian, the shapeshifter switches between creature transformations, ultimately resorting to his human self, a young poor man with ragged clothing. Then Fillian's old brick-sized phone rings and there's a shrill voice on the line. It's the crone from episode 1 and we see an image of her, which is absolutely terrifying. The witch tells the vampire cop how she paid off the shapeshifter with gold coins just to distract him and keep him busy throughout the night. She has Captain Mills hostage. Now, I don't really state this, but I do think it was self-explanatory. Captain Mills was working Captain Langley's investigation, leading her to the killer, the crone, and that is how she got captured. The crone gives Fillian a choice. Come to the location Captain Mills is being held at, an old church building in Mainridge, and willingly give the witch his heart, or Captain Mills will die. The call ends and the vampire cop is furious with the shapeshifter. The shapeshifter is remorseful and regrets everything, though we see a much angrier side to Fillian. Not loud or aggressive, rather eerily calm and soft-spoken. He tells the shapeshifter that he's going to spare him because of the good deeds done by his kind in Redwater. However, Fillian will also tell them what this man has done, so no shapeshifter in Redwater will ever let him back in. Fillian tells him that if he sees him again, he'll put a bullet between his eyes. Rarely do we see the side of Fillian Hunt, that angry, ruthless, cold nature personality. With just a few minutes remaining, this episode ends off on a cliffhanger, with Fillian running like the wind trying to conjure up a plan with every stride on how he's going to save Captain Mills. I shall end part 1 of the breakdown here, which is basically the halfway mark of the series. Part 2 will shed light on the remaining episodes as well as the in-depth vampire lore of the villains, such as Mercer, the vampire mercenary who appears in the finale. I will also explain how my version of Dracula's castle functions, which hasn't been mentioned in the series and serves more as lore to the vampire realm rather than plot-driven. Some honorable mentions for characters to appear in part 2 of the breakdown next week will also be Cecilia Rosenthal's backstory, which was the Duchess of Redwater, the vampire who turned Flat Tepish. Then I will explain Nazduk's the vampire priest story, which sets up book 2. So as you can see, there's still a lot to dissect and explain, and I really don't want to cram that into this video, especially when I'm sounding like Squidward. There's going to be a lot of new stuff in part 2 that hasn't been told before. As always, it's a pleasure writing these stories and sharing a piece of my mind with you. Until the next one, do take care.